When I began this research, it was in the early 2000s, and there was hardly any literature on this subject, either in English, in French, and in Arabic. A few articles about Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, a few books about Bahrain, but nothing on the other Gulf monarchies. And generally, there were very few things about Shia political Islam in the Gulf monarchies. I arrived on the field in 2002 in Bahrain first with ideas that I got from my readings and readings about the Gulf, but readings also about Shias in Iraq and in Lebanon. And arriving in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, I got exactly what I expected to find. Narratives about discrimination, about marginalization, political struggles to restore equality between Sunnis and Shias, political movements with exclusive sectarian recruitment and clerics acting as political entrepreneurs. And while it was very different, I mean, culturally speaking, from my fieldwork in Israel, for example, I heard very familiar narratives. Things, however, were very different when I began my fieldwork in Kuwait after Bahrain. Here, I faced unexpected narratives about people telling me basically that they were feeling happy as Shias in Kuwait, that they thought that Shias had their place in Kuwait, they were respected, they had religious freedom, freedom of trade. My first move was to think that somehow, for some reason, those Kuwaiti Shias were not speaking their mind sincerely. And that something else was at stake, and for some reasons they wanted to present this kind of rosy picture. But I quickly came to the conclusion that I needed to take seriously those narratives that were articulated in a context very different from Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, a context of freedom of speech, a context of religious freedom, a context where there were Shia representatives in the parliament, in the army, in the major institutions. So I really had to change the software that I somehow had built throughout my studies of Israeli Arabs and my previous fieldwork experience in Bahrain and my readings about Shias overall. I'm sure you're aware that what you read about Shias and what you hear from Shias themselves very often is victimization, is complaints. So we go out with this picture that this idea that Shias everywhere, they do not feel at home except in Iran, where Shi'ism is the state religion. And my confrontation with the Kuwaiti case was very challenging, and it helped me somehow to refine this picture, and that's what I would like to share with you today, and make you think further about the situation, the very, very different situations of Shias from one state to another. So I think in order to understand these differences, we need to go back to history, and in particular to look at the way the Shias were positioned in the state formation process in the different Gulf countries. The main hypothesis here is that the state formation process has had a defining impact on the group identity of the Shias in the different Gulf countries, and also on their relations with the states and the rulers. What is very specific with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, which sets them apart from other Gulf monarchies, is that they are conquest states, that is, states that were created as the result of military conquest. And in this military conquest, the Shias were on the side of the vanquished. In Bahrain, the El Khalifa, which is the current ruling dynasty, arrived in the archipelago at the end of the 18th century. and they present their arrival as a fath, that is, a conquest for the sake of Islam. Let's say. At the time, Bahrain was formerly a part of the Persian Empire. It was the 14th province of the Persian Empire. It was governed for the sake of Persia by a local tribe or a local Arab tribe. And the Al-Khalifa defeated this local ruling dynasty. And the official history of Bahrain is presenting the first Al-Khalifa ruler of Bahrain is nicknamed as Ahmed al-Fatih, so Ahmed who won the battle. And the conquest of Bahrain is being presented as something like the Al-Khalifas have brought back Bahrain into the realm of the Arab nation and supposedly into the realm of true Islam, that is Sunni Islam, as opposed to Shia Islams. The circumstances of the conquest are a matter of dispute in contemporary Bahrain, as is history in general. The Bahraini society is burdened by narratives about the history, and those narratives are used by political actors to substantiate political positions and more broadly to contest one's position in the social stratification. The different ways the history of the conquest is recounted is revealing of two different registers of legitimacy. So as I told you, the official history promoted by the Al-Khalifa dynasty maintains that Bahrain was set free from Persian domination, reintegrated into the Arab nation. So the narrative amounts very much to a narrative of national liberation. The Shias, for their part, they insist that the Al-Khalifa, when the Al-Khalifa and their allies conquered Bahrain, the archipelago was inhabited only by Shias, or at least that the Shias represented the vast majority of the inhabitants. They will explain you that the Shias of Bahrain are called the Baharna, and that Baharna means the native inhabitants of Bahrain, the Sukkan Asliyin. So it's a very important concept in Bahrain, and that the Sunnis basically are no less than alien invaders. They don't really belong to Bahrain, and hence they have no legitimacy in ruling this country. This version of history has been supported by the work of Shia Islamic activists in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. They have published various historical accounts which have given somehow a scientific veneer to this nativist narrative. So the register of legitimacy, which is being mobilized here, is that of populating anteriority and of what we can call autochthony, if you want, as opposed to foreigners. We find very similar debates in Saudi Arabia. There, the Shias also underline that they had been submitted to violent conquest by the Al Saud ruling dynasty, and that they are the native, the original inhabitants of the eastern part of the kingdom, a region that was part of what is called their ancient Bahrain, because in old historical writings, Bahrain was actually the region comprised between Basra in southern Iraq and the peninsula of Qatar. And the coastal area was called Bahrain before that. And so Saudi activist intellectuals have this idea that the Baharna are actually the original people who was living there in what is today the Saudi Eastern Province and Bahrain, and so that the Saudi Shias and Bahraini Shias belong to the same people, and that they have inhabited the region long before the ruling dynasties came to the region. What is specific about the Saudi case as compared to the Bahraini case is that Shias there have been submitted to specific sectarian persecution. I'm sure you are aware that let's say, the political ideology, the political and religious ideology on which the El Saud regime is based is so-called Wahhabism, so a very strict version of Sunni orthodoxy, which considers that the Shias are not real Muslims because they associate to the cult of God, the cult of human beings, mainly the Prophet Muhammad, Fatima, and the Imams. So what is important to keep in mind is that in the Saudi and Bahraini cases, the Sunni Shia divide is overlapping with other types of divide, namely the conqueror-conquered divide and the alien-native divide, which helps, of course, and explains why this sectarian divide is so anchored and rooted into the society and the politics in these two states. Narratives about the history of Kuwait and the place of the Shias in Kuwait differ widely from these nativist accounts that we find in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. There, the Shias, and I think it's very important, they share the narrative of the Hadar segment of their Sunni fellow citizens. The Hadar, it means, refers here to the segment of the Kuwaitis who claim they have been here, residing in Kuwait, living in Kuwait before the oil era. That is roughly before the late 30s and early 40s. And the Hadar are opposed to the so-called Badu or tribal people in Kuwait, who in the specific Kuwaiti context are the people who came to Kuwait between the 50s and the 70s and did not, in the eyes of the Hadar, participate in the building, in the foundation of the state. The Hadar narratives, the Hadar narrative in Kuwait stresses that Kuwait was founded by a gathering of tribes and families at the end of the 18th century, and that these people came from different areas of the Middle East, the ruling Al-Sabah family and what is called the merchant oligarchy, that is the people, the families who are today controlling the private sector, came from Central Arabia, from Najd. The Shias, most of them came from Iran. Other people came from Iraq, even from Lebanon, and that all these people came because they share basically an economic project, not a political project. They wanted to trade. They wanted to have a safe haven in which to trade in peace. And the idea, one of the basic pillars of the Kuwaiti national narrative is that the merchants delegated political authority to the rulers, the Al-Sabah dynasty, in exchange for freedom of trade. And the Shias perfectly espouse this narrative. This narrative is really, to sum it up, we Shia, we live in peace in Kuwait. We agree that the state is not Shia, but it's not a problem as long as we can live freely as Shias and that we can trade. We have the freedom of trade. So the majority, and it's also a very different demographic setting than in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, the Shia in Kuwait are organized today in three major diasporic groups. By diasporic group, I mean people who have kept family ties and economic ties, commercial ties with their countries of origin, people who maintain extensive cross-border ties. The largest group is that of the Ajam, which means the people of Iranian descent. They came in Kuwait at different periods in time from the beginning of the 18th century, according to the narratives of the oldest Shia families, up to the early 20th century. The Iranian populating of Kuwait is part of a classical pattern of border migration. The second group is the Hassawin. Hassawin are people coming from Hassa, and Hassa is a part of today's the eastern province of contemporary Saudi Arabia. And the third group are the Baharna. So the Baharna in the Kuwaiti context refers to the people who came from Bahrain. What is important to bear in mind for the Hassawis and the Baharna is that they came to Kuwait for trade, yes, also, but also to escape persecution and political instability in Hassa and Bahrain. So what they see is that the state somehow is a shelter. So they fled their country because they couldn't live anymore there, and they found peace and protection in Kuwait. And so they still see the Al-Sabah ruling family as a protector, and the state as a shelter. So it's, you understood, a totally different pattern from the situation of Shias in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And also, you understood also that the divide between natives and aliens is present also in Kuwait, but it doesn't overlap with the Sunni Shia divide, because Shias see themselves as natives, as part of the old Hadar population, and the foreigners are the Bedou. And so the Shias share with Sunni Hadar this state of the Bedou people who are seen as backwarded people, or people who just came to Kuwait just to benefit from the allocation of the welfare state and never fought really for the survival and the building of Kuwait. So on the basis of these very different patterns of state formation, Shias have positioned themselves very differently in the political arenas of these free states. In particular, when from the late 60s onward, the Shia identity became politicized in the framework of Shia Islamic movements. Everywhere in the Gulf, these movements are coming from two rival transnational political religious networks based in Iraq. The first network and the most important one is the Dawah network. And Dawah, you might know that it's a political party in Iraq, which is still there today. It was the political party of the ex-Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, a party that was born in the late 50s in Najaf, so the main center of religious authority for Shi'ism, until today. The party was intimately tied to the clerical establishment of the city of Najaf in Iraq. The second network is the so-called Shirazi network, which was woven around the figure of Mohammed Shirazi, who died in 2001, a cleric who was based in Iraq, but in another city of Karbala. I'm sure you know it's a pilgrimage city where Hussein has his mausoleum. And Shirazi positioned himself as a challenger of the Najafi Marja'iyya. The Marja'iyya is the specific Shia religious authority that emerged in the course of the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century. I'm sure you'll see that in your class very soon. So Al-Dawah spread to the Middle East from Iraq through the networks, the transnational networks of students. The Hawza of Najaf was, until the 70s, the main place of training for Shias wanting to become clerics. And when those students came back to their countries of origin, they created cells of Dawah. It happened in Lebanon, it happened in Bahrain also. And also, Dawah spread through exiles. From the 70s onward, the Iraqi regime crushed the seminars of Najaf and the underground Shia political movements, leading many people to leave Iraq, and many actually established for a few years in Kuwait, and then also fostered the creation of cells of Al-Dawah in the Gulf countries. And the Shirazi network spread also through exiles, and Mohammed Shirazi himself established in the early 70s in Kuwait, so to escape repression and Iraq. And from Kuwait, he sent one of his nephews to Bahrain. We will speak about that later. So in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, unsurprisingly, the two networks developed in local organizations, underground organizations, which entered into bitter confrontation with the regimes. The defining moment in Bahrain was the disbanding of the parliament in 1975. Al-Dawa had representatives in the parliament, and they allied with the secular opposition to defeat a bill by the ruler, a bill on state security, which curtailed the civil liberties. The Shiraziyin, so the Shirazi networks, they were not in the parliament, but right after the disbanding of the parliament, they announced the creation of the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, so an organization. The name, you understand, is leaving no ambiguities about the program, which was to bring down the monarchy and replace it with an Islamic state on the Shia model. The advent of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was another defining moment. It further aggravated the struggle between the regime and the Shia movements, with both Al-Dawa and the Shiraziyin embracing with enthusiasm the ideology of the Iranian Revolution, the so-called Wilayat al-Faqih doctrine, and this ended up in Bahrain in 1981 with a failed coup by the Shiraziyin, which somehow marked the beginning of an all-out repression against both the Shirazi and the Dawa networks, leading the cadres of the two networks to go into exile, mostly in Iran, but also in London. In Saudi Arabia, the defining moment was also the Islamic Revolution in Iran, with the Shirazi being the main actor behind what is being remembered in Saudi Arabia until today as the Muharram Intifada in November 1979, an uprising which was suppressed by the regime and led also many cadres from the Shirazis to relocate in Iran. At this point, and maybe before shifting to Kuwait, I would like to present you a more refined picture of the situation in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. What I told you is the thing that you read everywhere, and it's true. It's not that it's not true. But I'd like to stress that before, let's say, the second half of the 70s, that is before the disbanding of the parliament in Bahrain, the relations between the Shias and the state was characterized by what I called pragmatic sectarianism. That is, while the Shias were for sure not part of the higher strata of the social fabric, they had not access to the most essential administrative positions, and in particular in Saudi Arabia, they were considered as deviating from true Islam, and they were not having religious freedom. They were not seen, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind, they were not seen as a security threat. And Shia religious institutions were even considered as partners by the regime. For example, in Bahrain, the regime has always been very tolerant anyway towards the expression of Shia religiosity. We should not confuse between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. The Bahraini government is not Wahhabi. There is religious freedom. There are Shia mosques everywhere, and there are even 2 days off, official 2 days off for Muharram, on the 9th and 10th of Muharram. In the 60s and the 70s, the Shia religious movements and Shia institutions in particular were seen by the regime as potential allies against the Marxist and Arab nationalist opposition movements, which were at the time the strongest and were representing in the eyes of the regime a security threat in the first place, so the Bahraini government encouraged the activities of al-Da'wah and the Shirazin, and for example, the head of the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, Hadi al-Mudarrisi, who was an Iraqi, was granted the Bahraini citizenship very few time after he got to Bahrain in 1974, which, if you know how it was difficult and how it is difficult to get the citizenship of one countries when you are foreign, this move was very significant. Significant that those people were not seen as a threat. Hadi al-Mudarrisi was even granted a program on the Bahraini TV, a religious program, where he spoke about Islam and Shia Islam in particular. In Saudi Arabia, when the Saud arrived in the eastern province in 1913 and conquered the province where the vast majority of the Shias live, the Shia notables agreed not to resist, not to fight the armies of the Saud, and in exchange they managed to negotiate a degree of religious recognition so that despite the apparent irreconcilability between Shi'ism and Wahhabism, the Saudi rulers granted the Shias an amount of institutional distinctiveness, institutional recognition, the Shias were recognized as a distinct madhab, a distinct sect within Islam. This was because the Saud wanted to compromise, were ready to compromise with ideology for the sake of state building. At the time, the eastern province was key in the economy of the newly founded kingdom because it had a lot of ports which were very wealthy, and it was essential that economic activity could go on in this part of the kingdom. And after when oil was discovered actually in this region, the vast majority of the kingdom's oil reserves are actually based in Shia areas, so it was all the more vital to maintain stability and not to confront the Shias overtly. And for example, the Saud never envisaged to convert en masse the Shias to Wahhabi Sunni Islam, and they even resisted such projects when they were pushed forward by Sunni zealots, the clerics or so-called Ikhwan, which was a corps of warriors recruited from the Bedouin population who actually wanted either to kill the Shias or have them converted to true Islam. But the Saud disbanded this Ikhwan corps and agreed even to keep the Shia local institutions. For example, they agreed that 2 Shia religious courts be maintained, one in Qatif and one in Hassa, and those the judges, the Qadi, who were officiating in those courts were even granting the status of civil servants of the Ministry of the Interior. Another sign of the pragmatism of the Saudi regimes toward the Shias before the Iranian Revolution was the fact that Aramco, so the oil company, recruited a lot of Shias because the Shias were living in the province, and so this very strategic sector before the Iranian Revolution was not at all reluctant to hire Shias, and the majority of the students of the Oil and Petroleum University of Tehran were actually Shias. And the oil company has been a major instrument of upward social mobility for the Shias. So in Kuwait now, until the Iranian Revolution, Shia politics was marked by unconditional support of the Shia merchant notability for the Sabah ruling dynasty against its opposition. Opposition in Kuwait at this period mainly came from the Sunni merchant oligarchy, which was struggling to maintain a measure of power sharing with the Sabah. That is, they wanted to have a say in succession matters, for example. The first episode of the building of this very strong and enduring alliance between the Shias and the rulers is the episode of the so-called assembly movement of 1938. It was really a defining moment in the history of the relation between the Shias and the state in Kuwait. The merchant oligarchy, which was Sunni, mobilized at this period to impose on the ruler a legislative assembly to be elected by the 150 important families of Kuwait, all Sunnis. The emir finally moved to disband the assembly after 6 months of existence, leading its members to take refuge in a fortified citadel. And after a few days of siege, the emir obtained the capitulation of the rebels, who most of them fled to Iraq or were arrested. The assembly's failure, in part, was the result of the merchant oligarchy's inability to bring the Shia notability in their project. No Shia were indeed among the members of the assembly, and the assembly took steps which the Shia saw as endangering their interest. The assembly refused what the Shias demanded, that is the creation of Shia institutions. They wanted a Shia school, they wanted a Shia religious court. The assembly refused. The assembly also hated Mullah Saleh, who was the personal secretary of the emir at the time, and he was an Iranian. He was a Sunni Iranian, but he was considered by the Shias their main gate, let's say, as the people who granted them direct access to the ruler, and as the key people defending their interest. And significantly, after the assembly refused all the demands of the Shias, under the leadership of one of their clerics, Mahdi Qazwini, of Iranian descent, Qazwin, organized a large demonstration in front of the fort, the citadel where the assembly was based, demanding, the disbanding of the assembly, and of course they were supported by the emir. That's how, politically, the Shia merchant notability became one of the main constituencies of the rulers. Because it was based, you understood, on a coalition of interest, on shared interest against the opposition. And up to the 80s, the Shia representatives, the Shia members of the parliament were all pro-government. And they saw the El Sabah as their best protection against the hostility of the Arab nationalists, in particular. The Arab nationalists in Kuwait were very much inspired by Arab nationalists, the Iraqi version, which was very anti-Iranian. The shift occurred mainly after the Iranian Revolution again. That was a defining moment. The Dawah network in Kuwait took, like in Bahrain, embraced the Wilayat al-Baqi doctrine, the tenets of the Iranian revolution. The project initially was not to have a rupture with the Kuwaiti government, but to empower the Shias as a community, as a specific group in the society. They wanted also to change the balance and the recruitment of the political elites within the Shia population, wanting to foster young people coming from the middle classes rather than the old Iranian merchant notability. The decision of the Kuwaiti government in 1976 to disband the parliament, like it happened in Bahrain a year earlier, radicalized these young Shia people who came to define themselves as opponents to the regime. So it's really the first occurrence of the emergence of a Shia opposition. And after the parliament was reinstated, after the Iranian Revolution, they defeated the old merchant notability, the old Shia merchant notability, and became the main political force among the Shia population in Kuwait. This pattern went on after the Gulf War, so after the Iraqi invasion, with the rise of the National Islamic Coalition, which is the main expression, embodiment of the Dawah network in Kuwait. The main project of this group was not sectarian, strictly speaking, as compared with the project of other Shia political groups which were closer to the ruling family and the government. It was a project to build a coalition with other segments of the society in order to improve to democratize, let's say, the regime, to empower the parliament in particular, and they had a tendency to tone down their Shia distinctiveness in their public language, and they were instead, in a typically Iranian manner, I would say, they had a tendency to stress a general Islamic identity rather than a specific Shia identity. But that is to be kept in mind. These people, the National Islamic Coalition, they were, if you understood me well, pro-Iranian, pro-Wilayat al-Faqih, but they were reliable loyalists. I mean, they had not as a project to bring down the monarchy, to replace the ruler. They accepted that Deir Sabah remained the ruler in Kuwait. They just wanted for the parliament to have more power, so to have more balance, let's say, between the parliament and the emir. Things changed and returned somehow to normal after 2008. 2008, the end of 2008, was the period during which Ayman Moughniyeh was assassinated in Damascus. You have followed the news. Ayman Moughniyeh was a leading member of Hezbollah, a notorious official of the armed branch of Lebanese Hezbollah, suspected to be behind a bunch of terrorist attacks in particular. The Islamic National Alliance took the controversial decision to organize a public rally in 2008 to mourn Ayman Moughniyeh. This was very controversial in Kuwait because Moughniyeh is suspected to have organized a wave of bombing in Kuwait in the mid-80s, which included an attempt at the life of the emir. So it was seen by many Kuwaitis, including many Shia Kuwaitis, as somehow mourning and celebrating someone who had attacked Kuwait. The people who organized the rally were arrested for a few days. They were released soon afterwards, but after they were released, they changed politically. They made a shift 180 degree. Indeed, they were stigmatized and criticized within the Shia community itself for having endangered the relation between the Shias and the rulers, and that was seen as very dangerous because remember, they have these ideas, the Shias in Kuwait, that the rulers are protecting the Shias and that hostility is not coming from the state, it's coming from segments of the Sunni of the society. Since this period, I was telling you, things have come back to what they were before the mid-70s and before the Iranian Revolution, with the Islamic National Alliance defining itself as pro-Wilayat al-Faqih, as pro-Iranian Islamic Republic, became one of the most reliable allies of the ruling family and of the government in a context marked by increasing struggles and conflicts between the parliament and the government. The government is appointed by the emir, and the parliament was and still is very much dominated by the opposition, that is a coalition of Salafi, Muslim Brothers, and so-called tribal MPs, that is, MPs coming from this famous Bedou population who came between the 50s and the 70s to Kuwait. This opposition has tried several times to bring down the prime minister, who is from the ruling Al Sabah family. This opposition has specialized in grilling ministers all the time. This is a peculiarity of Kuwaiti politics in the past years, and the Shias have been supporting the prime ministers against all the grillings. So the alliance has been consolidated, and the Shias have been the first benefiters from different reforms of the voting system, which has improved their share at the parliament. So as a conclusion, is Kuwait an exception in the Gulf? No, that's what I discovered. Kuwait is not an exception. I would say that Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are exceptions in Bahrain. Because if you look at the situation of Shias, for example, in Oman, in Qatar, you will find very similar narratives and positioning than you see in Kuwait. Just to take a last example, the one of Oman. In Oman, there are very few Shias, but there is a particular Shia community which are called the Lawatiya. The Lawatiya are people who came from Sindh in contemporary Pakistan, probably during the 17th or 18th century, and came in order to trade in Oman and establish themselves in the coastal cities, Muscat and other cities on the north. They were amongst the constituencies of the Sultanate, in a situation where there was a division of power between the Sultanate and the Ibadi Imamate. I don't enter into too much detail, but we find here also a pattern in which the central power, the Sultanate, relied on, generally speaking, on trading minorities in order to establish its power against the Arab tribes based in the Omani interior. And this is at the origin of a very strong alliance and very close proximity between the rulers and the Lawatis, who are controlling large companies. One of the largest, biggest companies of the private sector are actually family companies run by Lawatis. Lawatis are very wealthy, and overall you find a lot of Shias and a lot of Shias of Iranian descent in Oman, in the police and in the army, where they are overrepresented, which shows you also that Shia are not seen as a threat by the regime, by the Sultan Qaboos in particular. So I would say that somehow there are all sorts of configuration of state-Shia relation, and we should look maybe at more positive situations in order somehow to understand that the content of identities, the content of group identities is only one of the determining factors in the relations of a group with the state. I mean by that, Shias have make victimization a part of their identity. That is no doubt. But this content can be overcome to develop actually constructive relations with the states when the circumstances allow it. Of course. Thank you.